as we got into the Word this morning, we're actually going to be watching an interview by Ravi Zacharias on evangelism, and it's such a profound reminder on the importance and the value of the good news that we hold. And this is a prequel to our new series that's going to be starting next Sunday. And so I really want you to check in, really tune in to what he's got to say. But he really highlights three important factors, 3 points. And one is the need for evangelism. The second one is the how to evangelize, as well as the need for us to grow personally in our relationship with Jesus. So just check in, tune. It's going to be an amazing time to receive a word for us this morning. So be blessed this morning.
Well, Ravi, I'm thrilled that we have a chance to have this series of conversations together. And I hope this resource will be a great blessing to many, as producing the content has been a blessing to us. And I want to start with 1 Peter 3:15. It's something of a motivating verse for us, for your ministry, for RZIM. Why is that? In your hearts, set apart Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you for the reason for the hope that you have, but do this with gentleness and respect. Why is that so central to our ministry?
I think it's a beautiful text and context for what we call Christian apologetics. Apologetics really has twin tracks on which the apologist must run. The first has to do with answering questions, soft and hard, and the second has to do with making truth claims clear, not ambiguous, not vague, but clearly stating the truths. And I find it fascinating, Vince, that these words come to us from a fisherman called Peter, that had come to us from Saul of Tarsus, converted to Paul, or even Luke, the medic, so on. You would say these are real thinkers, dealing with the hard questions. But here's an ordinary, simple fisherman who says what the apologist must be and what the apologist must do. And it always follows in that order. In your heart, set apart Christ as Lord. This is the same man to whom Jesus had said, "Who do you say that I am?" So the lordship of Christ is central to the apologist. In your heart, set apart Christ as Lord, and always be prepared to give an answer. And how do you do that? You see, the goal of apologetics is not to vanquish the questioner, not to destroy the questioner or overcome the opponent. It is to win the opponent. And that's why he says to answer with gentleness and respect of anyone who asks of you. This is really the banner of Christian apologetics and what the apologist must look like.
Yeah, that's great. And I know this verse was such an encouragement to me. I was initially skeptical when I got to college. I was studying philosophy at Princeton University, and my conception of faith was blind faith, that faith was blind by definition. And that actually changed in my life by reading the Bible. And I began to read through the Gospels, and then especially when I got to the Acts of the Apostles, and I started coming across words like reasoning and convincing and even proving and persuading, the word that's most used in the Bible for when someone becomes a Christian. And I thought, this book isn't at all asking me to take a blind leap of faith. It's talking about one people group being more noble than the other because they examined the scriptures daily to determine if what it said was true. It talked about there being confirmation for everyone because God had raised Jesus from the dead. And then I continued to read. I got to 1 Corinthians 15, especially verses 3-8, where we get that wonderful list, that early creed of all the people that Jesus had appeared to and spent time with after he had clearly died. And I couldn't believe it. I remember I arranged meetings with two of the top New Testament professors, both atheists at Princeton in the religion department at the time. And I brought this to them and I said, I thought faith was blind, but now I'm reading through the Bible. That's not at all what it's asking of me. And in fact, it's saying I can have confirmation of this faith because very shortly after Jesus clearly was killed, all of these people were utterly convinced that they were spending time with him. How do you account for that if not by the resurrection? And neither of them were able to give me a good answer. And it made me think, actually, this is a faith which is asking me to take my mind seriously. And that was very important to me. One of the things I worry about today is how people with hard questions, like I had hard questions, are responded to. I mean, what would you say to someone today, maybe a young person, who has hard, difficult questions doesn't find faith easy? Should they feel ashamed of that? Should they be labeled as a doubter? Or is there actually something good about that?
You know, that's fascinating as I'm hearing you talk and my mind is going back to my own youth. Vince, you know, you came to this through a very cerebrally driven pursuit. You know, you're at one of the finest universities of the world, one of the strongest philosophy departments in the world at Princeton, and you're struggling with the rational issues and the intellectual issues as a young philosopher. I was not of that vintage. I was struggling through school because my whole pursuit was really more in sports and cricket, but I struggled existentially.
Yeah.
So to me, the questions at that point were not so much intellectually driven as existentially relevant. That was my heartbeat. I was looking for meaning. I was looking for peace. I was looking for hope. And, you know, in India, which is such a pluralistic culture in terms of religion, India is sort of the largest religion manufacturer of the world. You know, the Hinduism is born there, Buddhism is born there. It's actually, if India and Pakistan had not separated, it would be the largest Islamic nation in the world. Jainism, Sikhism, both were conceived out there. And so you grow up surrounded by and actually immersed in religion. To me, they were all equally irrelevant because they all bordered to me on ceremonial expression, superstition, feeling good and not fearful. Put these marks on your door, go and give this in the temple, put these marks on your forehead. That's the way I saw it. But deep inside my heart, I knew that I didn't have any meaning. And fascinatingly, I never thought it would come in, quote, religion. I never thought it would come from a transcendent worldview. But when I found Christ, on that bed of suicide, to find peace, hope, grace, forgiveness, love, and the motivating point of relationship, it changed everything for me. Then began my intellectual journey. It's like I made a commitment because I had the need, but then I started asking the questions about how do I know this is not just a momentary leap of belief, rather than a coherent worldview that is going to meet my needs.
That's great. And so sometimes the questions come en route to faith. Sometimes they actually come in response to that initial expression of faith.
I think that's the way, even the difference between the rest of the disciples and Saul of Tarsus to Paul. You know, he says that I may know him, the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of his suffering, being made conformable unto his death. It's fascinating because the rest of them came through the birth, life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. But Saul came from the resurrection through the death and suffering. And he says, I need to understand that side of it because he had seen the risen Lord. So he moved to it logically, and the rest of them moved through it chronologically. Sometimes God meets us at different situations in our life, but ultimately takes us back to why he is the truth.
That's great. And so the questions can be existential from the heart. They can be philosophical in the mind. They can come before one comes to faith. They can come after one comes to faith. One of the things I love about this ministry, and I've really learned this from you, Ravi, is to receive all questions as a gift. Asking questions is the way that you get to know a person. If I want to get to know you as a friend, I ask you good, deep questions about yourself, and I listen hard to the answers. So I want to encourage everyone that I come into contact with, ask those hard questions. That's how you get to know any person, and so that's how you get to know the person of Jesus Christ as well. My wife, Jo, and I have a friend that we met with recently to talk about faith, and she said to us that as a youngster, she asked her church-going mother, did Jesus really rise from the dead? And her mom responded, Nicole, don't be difficult. And that was the last real question that she ever asked about God. And today, she's one of the most intellectually accomplished atheists that we know. So that is really what we don't want. From my perspective, from your perspective, every question is an open door. And there's a real theological reason for that, because the answer to any question is something true, and all truth finds its grounding in God. So we're happy to go to different forums, many different places, and allow people to ask any question they want, because if we're thinking prayerfully enough and creatively enough and in community enough, then actually the answer to any meaningful question should be something that leads back to who God is and what he's done.
The old adage holds true, Vince. It's better to debate a question before settling it than to settle a question before debating it. Sooner or later, even if you don't ask the question, somebody else will. You know, as a grandfather now, I watch children very differently to what I did as a father. As a father, the anxiety level is higher. You're trying to raise children, you're trying to provide for children, all of this. But as a grandfather, you're somewhat removed from that immediate strain, and you're watching more the marvel of childhood. And I'm watching my grandkids ask questions early.
Yeah.
You know, Jude, our oldest of the four, is 6 now. But when he was 5, he was asking questions about what does a miracle mean? But tell me, what is the meaning of a miracle? And when he reads stories, when he's reading the Narnia Chronicles and all, his eyes are wide, he's thinking, he's processing. I tell people to look at it this way. Don't think of every question as a doubt. Look at a question, as you said, as a door, as an opportunity for knowing more and understanding. I think that's how we really grow. The day you stop asking questions, you are either fallaciously assuming you're infinite in your knowledge, or you've really stopped growing. Questioning and dialoguing within yourself, that dialogical process is critical in trying to understand more and more. I still do. In fact, my mother used to say to me when she was around, why do you come up with so many questions? But that's the way I was, and I think that's the way Easterners are, because we are immersed in so many contrary worldviews.
Yep, I was like that as well. So glad that my parents took my questions serious as well. Even if they weren't in a position to answer some of them, they took them seriously. I just want to return for a second. So 1 Peter 3:15, it tells us to be prepared to give an answer. And then at the end, it says, but do this with gentleness and respect. Which is more important, if you can put it that way? To give the answer, do it with gentleness and respect.
I think if you give an answer without gentleness and respect, you have cut off the person's nose. And now you're offering them a rose to smell. You can't do that. But if you're very gentle and very respectful, but really no answers, the person is going to say, this is a very naive and a nice individual, but there are no answers here. I think it's not an either-or case of figuring out whether the manner is more important than the content or the content is more important than the manner. You see, the person has to believe you before they believe what you say. They have to respect you before they respect your truth. It is a very hard discipline to be a patient listener and an understanding answerer to a person's questions. As I always say, behind a question is a questioner.
Yeah.
And if you do not answer the questioner, you're really not answering the question. So I think both of them have to be held in equal importance and equal tandem.
Yeah, that's really good. I think one of the things that's most challenging about this verse is that it just assumes in 1 Peter 3:15 that people are going to be asking us questions about the reason for the hope that we have. That's a challenging assumption for each of us, for everyone. Are we living lives that cause people to ask those questions? And I think, like you said, the gentleness and the respect is right at the center of whether or not those questions are going to be asked.
You know, it's normal growing up to ask questions. But as one is maturing in age, if they stop asking questions, they've come to one or two conclusions. Number one, there are no answers. There's no point asking them. Or number two, this is not the place to ask them. People here are not helping me with it. So the early stages of answering questions are very important. You can either stifle curiosity or neutralize the possibility of even conversation in the future. It is normal as a youngster to ask questions, especially of this nature at a time such as this, when culture is going through so many huge changes, to ask questions of truth, meaning, origin, destiny, and so on.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about Jesus among secular gods. We wrote this content because we wanted to help people to try to make an informed decision, like you said, in a culture where there are so many different options for what to believe and how to go about life. Do you think that we're in a particularly difficult time to make those sorts of decisions today compared to times of the past?
I have no doubt about it. Years ago, I wrote a book called Jesus Among Other Gods, in which I was dealing with the answers of Jesus in contradistinction to any other prophet or claimant to divine status, how different the answers of Jesus were. The content within the context of Jesus among secular gods is that secularism has become such a assumption in our time. It comes from the Latin saeculum, meaning this worldly. God is locked out, almost like the book of Ecclesiastes, under the sun, everything becomes meaningless. There's no perspective coming from, quote, above the sun, as it were. And with secularism holding sway and becoming the dominant worldview, then all religions are considered equally untrue or irrelevant. So what has happened in the secularistic thinking, we move through different positions. You move through relativism, humanism, scientism. You've got to find some other, quote, ism within which your worldview actually fits. So we booted out the transcendent, but we were not prepared for what is going to come in its place. The old adage used to be given by Chesterton, the tragedy of disbelieving in God is not that a person ends up believing in nothing. Alas, it is much worse. You may end up believing in anything. And so that anything is what secularism has brought us to, which we have to engage in a meaningful way. That's why the content of Jesus among secular gods.
That's really helpful. Yeah, I think we live in a culture now where there's so many different choices in terms of what we might believe, but we're also being told at the same time that to make a choice and to say that one of these options might be true or might be better than the other options is to be intolerant, is to be offensive. So we're given this vast array of choice, and we're told that to make a choice actually is going to brand you as someone you don't want to be. It's a very difficult time. And I this past year was on university campuses. On one of them in Chicago, we asked students, what is the meaning of life? And we gave them all different options for what that could be. Personal success, to pass on one's genes, to love others. And one after another, students would walk up to that question and just stand there paralyzed for minutes, because we're just paralyzed by the choice and the directive not to make a choice, or you might exclude other people. Very difficult time to make these sorts of decisions.
You're so right. And I think what has happened with the higher educational process is we have learned to sort of debunk worldviews, learn to debunk answers, and to question authority, to question any knowledge of absolutes. So we've got a generation of young people who have no answers except questions. And for someone to say, for you to claim to have answers is obviously very proudful or very arrogant to think, I just believe there is no one way. But that in itself is a choice. To say all choices that you make of an exclusive claim to truth is an arrogant choice. Well, that in itself is an arrogant choice then, to say that there are no claims that are ultimately valid. It is born out of a hubris. And one of my professors used to say about skeptics being better able to smell rotten eggs than lay good ones. I think there are no answers out there for people who debunk all answers. You have to legitimize the question, and you have to find meaningful answers.
Before we finish with this session, I just want to ask you briefly about the idea of a worldview. It's a term that we'll probably use again. What is a worldview? And then specifically, can you speak, because I find it so helpful, to this idea of a fourfold evaluation of a worldview: origin, meaning, morality, and destiny?
Right. A worldview, Vince, as you are well aware, and everybody is either consciously or unconsciously aware of, it's like a pair of glasses you've put on, where you're looking through the lens of certain pre-commitments, stuff that you already believe, and now that provides your vantage point through which you're looking at the rest of reality. Yeah, the four questions are origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. But when you're coming to the worldview, I believe there are about 5 or 6 testing points for a good worldview. When you're answering questions, are your answers corresponding to reality? That's the first test of a worldview. When all the answers are given, is there a coherence to all of these answers? Or is just one of your answers a good one and the rest of it is not congruous with what you've just said and contradictory? So correspondence, coherence, Third is very important. It must have explanatory power for reality. This is where secularism fails. It has no explanatory power for love. It has no explanatory power for ultimate meaning. Your worldview must have explanatory power, must be able to explain the undeniable realities. Then the fourth is it should not be too complex or too simple. That is a very important aspect of a worldview. You've got to keep it in that middle ground. Fifth, it is the fact that it should not have only one line of argument, which is oftentimes what worldviews will have. Science has disproved the existence of God because it tells us it is an old earth. That is a one line of argument loaded with assumptions to do away with every other transcendent worldview. So you take those five, and I actually got them years ago from a writer by the name of Arlie Hoover in his book that was written as a question and answer, Dear Agnos. But the sixth point that I have added, I think, is critical. It should be able to explain other worldviews. Okay. Why do I hold my worldview as exclusive? Am I able to explain counter perspectives? So correspondence, coherence, explanatory power. You have got not one line of argument. It's not too complex and not too simple, and ultimately to be able to explain other worldviews. Those 6 components come into your worldview to deal with the 4 questions of life, of origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. Everybody has a worldview. The only question is whether it's a tenable one or an untenable one.
Wonderful. So part of the explanatory power is origin, meaning, morality, destiny. Where did we come from? Where are we headed? What's
correct.
The purpose of life? How should we live in light of that?
All the existential realities. Why is love such a pursuit? Why is meaning such a pursuit? It must be able to explain these realities which we live with.
That's great. I was thinking the other day that without answers to those questions, that's like showing up at a sporting match. We're both lovers of sports, and showing up on a sporting match you're supposed to be playing in and not knowing when it started, when it's going to end, what the objective of the game is, or what the rules are. All you could do is pretend. And so many people don't have answers to those questions, origin, meaning, morality, destiny. All we can do then is pretend our way through life. Well, this has been fantastic to get us started, to have this conversation. I'm really looking forward to the next one.
Same here.